So Mark, let's move to Eagles Island. You and an environmental sciences assistant professor from UNC Wilmington, Dr. Osko Backstrom, have been doing research in the waters in and around Eagles Island, the island across from downtown Wilmington where the battleship North Carolina is. You are also on the Eagles Island Task Force that wants to turn Eagles Island into a nature park for education, recreation, and preservation purposes.
It's multifaceted. There's a lot going on Eagles Island. I will say that my colleague Osko Backstrom is a full professor now, and he's very proud of that. As a tenured professor, but Eagles Island, my interest and place there was started when I did the field school, 1975. That's where they took us, and I looked at this vessel, Nuestra Senora de Regla, and we did some mapping on that. The frames of a steamboat, and that's where, when I first began my the underwater career, the field school, that's the first place they took us. And at low tide, it was like a shipwreck, like you'd be diving on it, only you could access it. And it was 150 feet, and it had steam machinery, and it was a great beginning. Interesting thing is we never knew what the name of it was, and this continued on for about 20 years. And later on, I was working with a group of 8th graders in a special program, and that we focused on that site, and that's how we identified it as the Nuestra Senora de Regla. They did some historical work, and it was the most prominent. But between the bridge and the battleship, there's 40 derelict vessels, from little rowboats, tugboat. So there are over 40 shipwrecks or derelicts, boats that were laid up between the Memorial Bridge up to just past the battleship on the west side of the Cape Fear River, across from Wilmington. This is an area that was very active in the 18 and 1900s up to World War II. It was an area that was all swamp originally, and when they ran out of room on the Wilmington side for their wharves and their shipbuilding activities, they began to put dirt over there. A lot of times they would take old barges and fill them with stone and just pack them in there, and so build up the land, and then they could again have wharves. And there was a big tugboat company over there. There was a big shipyard that made ships during the Civil War and beyond. And just after the Civil War, just after the World War II, the state ports moved south, moved down below. And so this whole area was sort of went into disuse. You could see through different periods, starting with in the 1870s, when the Nuestra Senora was laid up and eventually burned. It was the first one to sink, but there were others during the Depression. A lot of these vessels were not used, and after they lay in there for a while, they got serviced, so they're there. And so that is a really neat trove of maritime history of all kinds. It just happened that it is also within the Wilmington Historic District. When the Wilmington Historic District, which is mostly old buildings, and it's on the Wilmington side, the people that developed it had the foresight to extend the boundaries across the river 100 feet onto the Eagles Island side to protect the view, the landscape view, so that this historic town wouldn't have all these condos looking at across. So all these shipwrecks that we were finding and these derelicts were within the district. And so what we did was spent a lot of time mapping them, determining what they were, plotting them. There were a couple East Carolina student theses that did this. So that whole stretch is a very interesting area that hopefully, as Eagles Island becomes a preserve, hopefully this is an attention can be a boardwalk and not only call attention to the battleship that is there and very prominent, but also the marine history down to this Nuestra Señora de Regla. The Señora de Regla was originally a vessel built in 1861, right at the beginning of the Civil War. It was on the way down to be delivered to the Cubans down in the harbor of Havana. It was going to be it was a ferry boat going to run between Regla and Havana. As it made its way down, it had engine trouble off of Hatteras, and it was then sort of limped its way on into Georgetown, South Carolina. And this is right in the beginning of the war. The Confederates were very interested in any vessel, and this is a ferry boat. It can operate in the shallow waters of North Carolina and South Carolina. So they were interested in getting it, but it was not theirs to get. It was made for the Cuban ownership. So it turns out that they released it, but the Spanish consul and some of the government people gave letters to them to take down to Cuba that would then be taken to Europe. And there were a lot of concerned citizens, mostly French and Spanish citizens in the area that didn't know what was happening with the Civil War, so they were trying to report in over to their loved ones. And there were also interests in the government, the Confederate government, to ordering war supplies from England. So that was all in this big batch of letters, and it was secured in the sort of a false bottom of the captain's chest, and also there were some panels cut out, and it was put in the walls of the. So they knew it was contraband. Because the Union was down in Port Royal, had just started the blockade of South Carolina, so and they were going right by there. So that took a while, but they let these letters on. They'd get to somewhere that had free access to ships heading over to Europe, but it got down a little bit further, and then the Union officers. Navy stopped it and were very interested in it as well. This is a perfect vessel to have some cannons on it and be able to blockade and do the work down there. And it just happened, it wasn't theirs to have, but some of the crew people were from the North and were sympathetic to the North, and so they secretly told the Union officer that they should check the walls, check around, because there were letters. And sure enough, they did do expansive search and found this trove of letters and confiscated the vessel. And eventually, it was put up for. It was because of this contraband. It became naval property, and it was turned into a vessel called the USS Commodore Hull. It was a ferry boat armed with guns and cannons, and it did a lot of patrolling up in the Albemarle Sound. It had a big standoff battle with the CSS Albemarle, which was one of North Carolina's big gunboats. And then after the war, it came down to Wilmington. It was decommissioned, and it became a pleasure boat, ferry boat that ran from Wilmington down to what is now Southport, Smithville, and ran for a while doing that. And then as it got more out of shape. It became more of a work vessel and became a salver, a vessel that had this big deck, and they could use it to salvage other sunken vessels. They were doing there was a lot of interest in this wrecks that had sunk around Wilmington during the Civil War to sort of recover metals and things from them. And then eventually in the 1880s, there was an article about it, and some boys, probably 8th graders, had been seen rowing over there, exploring and rowing back, and soon after there was a fire on the deck of the vessel. Again, it was just laid up, it wasn't being used, and burned. And it's such a great story. We found out that the Cuban owners, when they lost their vessel, they sued the United States government, lost their vessel. And this went all the way up the Supreme Court and was finally decided in their honor, or in the Cuban honor, and rewarded them hundreds of thousands of dollars with interest. In 1884, which was just a couple years after this thing burned. So we were able to get all those letters. We got UNCW language department to translate a lot of them. As I said, a lot of these letters were in French and Spanish, and asking, just reflecting the really unstable times it was for these foreign citizens that were here. And I mean, what a great history. Here's this wreck that, like I said, I started out just looking at it, using the measuring, and then we used it as this educational program. And it happened that after they had done their excavations, these 8th graders were able to help us move Bill Reeves's collection of newspaper clippings. He had done a lot of work through several decades of clipping newspapers and sorting them, and he had a big file on the ships that were in Wilmington. And so by finding that box finally during this move and getting it out, and and having measurements that sort of met, they eventually went into the Waccamaw file, and there's this article saying the Waccamaw was over in this exact location when these kids were coming off. And then it hinted that it used to be the USS Commodore Hull, and then you kept looking, and then it became the Nuestra Senora de Regla eventually. So that's a fantastic part of Eagles Island, and I certainly think that's the poster child, and that needs to be recognized. And hopefully, I talk about the battleship North Carolina, and then the battleship Nuestra Senora de Regla, USS Commodore Hull, is sort of anchoring a boardwalk along there.